Hello and welcome to the Nevada Commission on Ethics training video on disclosure and abstention. The ethics law has three main buckets of ethics violation types. The first is improper benefits, the second is disclosure and abstention, and the third one is cooling off. So today we're going to talk about that second one, disclosure and abstention. Take a second to read this quote from President Wilson. The disclosure and abstention part of the ethics law is really about ensuring there's transparency about conflicts of interest and relationships of public officers and employees. Just because you've chosen public service doesn't mean you have to cut off all your relationships with people. We understand that as individuals step up to serve, that they have relationships, that they have family relationships, business relationships, other types of relationships that create conflicts of interest. Having a conflict of interest in and of itself is not an ethics issue. But when those private relationships collide with your public duties, that's when the disclosure and abstention rules click in. And the ethics law demands that there be transparency about those conflicts of interest. So let's talk about disclosure first. Right, disclosure and abstention, they're in the same bucket, but they're two very different requirements, and we'll go over those each one. So we'll start with disclosure. As a public officer or employee, you're required to, before approving, voting, or acting on a matter, disclose a conflict of interest if, right, that outside relationship is based on a gift or a loan you received, you're about to take an act that benefits your own significant pecuniary interest, or the independence of a reasonable person would be affected by a commitment in a private capacity. It's that list of magical relationships under the ethics law. And there's one about former lobbying, or if you used to be a lobbyist within the last year and now you're taking action on something you lobbied on, you have to disclose that conflict of interest. So let me give you some examples. If you have a health inspector and you get your inspection list and your daughter's restaurant is on that inspection list, the ethics law is going to require you to disclose before you go out on that inspection. Your daughter is someone you have under the law commitment in a private capacity to, and so and a reasonable person might think you might inspect your daughter's restaurant differently than the general public, and so you need to make that disclosure. In that case, you would make that disclosure to your agency head, right, your agency director, who's ever in charge of the health inspectors, so that they can make a decision on what to do going forward. Another one we see a lot is a city councilwoman owns a business, and the city council is considering what the annual city business fees will be. That city councilwoman's business, that fee, she has a direct pecuniary interest in the amount of business fees that she pays. And so whether the city council is considering raising or lowering the business fees, she has an interest and needs to disclose that conflict of interest. The other one is if you have a business partner of a county commissioner, and that business partner has an item on the commission agenda, you have a commitment in a private capacity to someone that you have a continuing business relationship with. And so that county commissioner needs to disclose that conflict of interest prior to acting on the commission agenda. The ethics law requires certain detail to be in the disclosure. So that disclosure, in order to be a lawful disclosure, has to be in sufficient detail to inform the public if it's in a public meeting, or your agency head, of the nature of the relationship and the potential effect on government action. So if you think back to the health inspector can't just say, oh, I have a conflict of interest on my list of inspections. I'm going to go out and do them, and we'll catch you later. No, you have to say, hey, this restaurant is owned by my daughter, and it appears on my list of inspections. You have to give specific detail, right? If you're that city councilwoman, I own a business that is affected by this business fee. My business pays X amount of money, and the item that we're considering would change it by X amount of money, right? So sufficient detail to inform everybody about what that actual conflict is and how that government action you're about to take may impact you. And the disclosure has to be the time the action is considered. If you're that health inspector, you can't disclose to your boss after you go inspect the restaurant. You've got to do it before you go out and take the formal government action. Okay, so be thinking about that. Disclosure is about just declaring, hey, everybody, alert, alert, I have a conflict of interest in this matter. that I've been asked to work on, or that is on the agenda for upcoming meeting. Abstention is different. Abstention is fully sitting out the particular action, and so a public officer shall not vote upon or advocate for the passage or failure of a matter, essentially in the same rules as disclosure, right? The independence of a judgment of a reasonable person in office will be affected by the gift or loan, your own significant pecuniary interest, or that commitment in a private capacity. Again, abstention is you are completely sitting out that government action, and so it is kind of a more robust analysis, and there's a presumption in the ethics law. The ethics law says, look, if you've made an appropriate disclosure, you have appropriately shined a light on your conflict of interest. In certain circumstances, we won't require you to abstain from acting, because if you're an elected official, the people that elected you expect you to do your job, to be their voice in government. And if we have an abstention rule that's so strict that essentially their voice gets silenced, that's not a benefit of good government to anyone. And so the ethics law says, hey, if you've made a disclosure, abstention is only required in clear cases where your situation is going to be materially affected by the vote, right? Materially affected by the vote. And there's a presumption that if you're going to take an action that impacts a lot of people, including yourself, but you are not, you don't have any greater effect, greater or less effect than anybody else in that group, you can also participate. So if you think about the example of the city councilwoman with a business, and they're taking a look at business licensing fees, she should disclose, right? And once she disclosed, this presumption clicks in. As long as let's say they're reducing everybody's business license fees by 10%. She should disclose that she has a business, she pays a business license fee. The action they are about to take would reduce her liability under the business fee, but all businesses are being treated equally, and therefore this presumption of participation is triggered. She can vote on the matter, even though her business will be directly affected. Because she's not affected more or less than anyone else, she may proceed, right? So she needs to state her conflict on the record. She should talk about her abstention analysis on the record, that, in consultation with the agency attorney, she determined that she's no more or less affected by this matter than the other people affected by this matter, and so that she's permitted to participate. Again, this is critical. You only get to use these presumptions of participation if a proper and complete disclosure has been made. If your disclosure is missing, or your disclosure is not in sufficient detail, or your disclosure is late, then you cannot point to the presumptions of participation if somebody starts to question whether or not you violated the ethics law. That's it. So the basics of disclosure and abstention are about that transparency. Think about that President Wilson quote. The disclosure is about, hey, I have this conflict of interest. It's coming into collision with my public duty. The abstention piece is, I need to sit out this government action because I am so directly affected that a reasonable person may participate or take different action than I would, and none of the presumptions apply in my case. Thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about disclosure and abstention. We have a lot more information on our website about disclosure and abstention. You can also check in with our LinkedIn or our Twitter about recent cases about disclosure and abstention. We receive a lot of cases, both complaint cases and advisory opinion requests related to this topic, because for the most part, folks want to be doing the right thing and be transparent about their relationship. So again, thank you for taking the time to learn more about disclosure and abstention, and thank you for your public service.